Hi,
Hey,
Shaun.
Istvan, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
So you're
What's
calling from Florida.
there? I guess it's not good there. It's not good here either.
Uh,
So,
we adapt. We adapt.
yeah. Yes.
Hopefully, it will be over soon enough before we go totally crazy.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks a lot for accepting my invitation to say a few words about this week's or next week's topic in my class. So my class is about embodied. It's called embodied cognition, but actually it involves the entire 4E or even more than 4Es.
Right.
And right now, this next week, we are uh, introducing, the early embodied theory. So I have two names there, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. But I think we should start with Husserl, right?
Hmm.
And I would like to ask you to tell us something about why Husserl. So Husserl introduces this notion of phenomenology, which is partly a meta-philosophical uh, position that he elaborates. And why is this? Why was this a great innovation? In historical context.
Yeah. Well, I myself think that Husserl's work was important because he found a way to study subjectivity or the subject's lived experience, what experience actually is. And I think that ties in to a number of attempts in the history of modern philosophy. So someone like Hume, even going back to Locke and thinking about the stream of thought or the stream of consciousness, as William James called it, and the idea of how to study that, and also the whole Kantian idea of taking a transcendental perspective to sort of get down to the very basic conditions of possibility for that kind of experience to happen. It seems to me that Husserl found, in his own view, a kind of method to study that without simply taking a kind of non-transcendental, empirical, psychological approach to it. In some sense, that was the center of his project. I think this influenced a lot of people in terms of setting up phenomenology, and especially in France. Jean-Paul Sartre, Merleau-Ponty were all impressed by this type of approach. And I know that Merleau-Ponty went to study at the Husserl archives, and he read this manuscript, which is called Ideas 2, or Ideen 2. And he found there that Husserl was talking quite a bit about embodiment. And specifically, he learned from Husserl, I think, especially about this notion of the I can, a phrase that Husserl uses. The idea of the I can is about perception, which is what Merleau-Ponty was trying to sort out. And the idea is simply that when I perceive the world, I perceive it in terms of what I can do, how I can act in regard to the world. That's built in, that kind of pragmatic dimension, built into perception itself. So I think it's this same idea is reflected in Heidegger, his notion of the Zuhanden, the idea that the world in our primary experience, in our first experience of it, appears as something ready to hand, Zuhanden, and that means in a very pragmatic way, we engage with the world in this kind of initial pragmatic fashion before we even start thinking about it, before we think about what we're doing or know what we're doing, we're already engaged with the world. And Merleau-Ponty, I think, takes this and says, yes, we do this because we're embodied the way we are. So I think Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, this also comes to influence people like Gibson. Gibson, the psychologist, reads Merleau-Ponty. In fact, recommends that his students read Merleau-Ponty as well. And Gibson comes up, I think, with the perfect term for this notion of affordance. He used this English term, affordance, to signify something like this kind of pragmatic attitude that we have towards the world. So we see the world in terms of what it affords for our possible actions. And then, Gibson and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger especially also had an influence on Dreyfus. Dreyfus had an influence on Francisco Varela. And then we get embodied cognition sort of emerging from all of this.
Yeah, so we know the lineage, and it's a bit artificial to try to just pick out one or two authors, because everything is so interconnected, and you can go back and forth and find very similar and different, but yet similar in important ways ideas. I want to ask you something about Descartes, actually. So we know that Husserl has different stages of his work, and actually in his later stage, he has a book called Cartesian Meditations, and people, the textbook would say that, well, this phenomenology was also a reaction to Cartesianism in some ways. But then actually later, in his later work, Husserl somehow gets a bit back to Descartes in some ways. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think in some ways. So Descartes has always been sort of considered the bad boy of modern philosophy from the perspective of, say, contemporary philosophy of mind. And across the board, whether you're doing embodied cognition or not, even in the cognitivist tradition, Descartes has, in some way, people like Dan Dennett, for example, been the evil demon, so to speak, behind all of this. But of course, there are people who defend Descartes and say, well, look, Descartes wasn't simply the Descartes of the Meditations. There was a lot more to Descartes. He wrote about the passions, for example. So the first thing is simply that we should think about Descartes as being, rich in terms of what his philosophy really was. But of course, the most famous part of his philosophy, comes from the Meditations, and he has this kind of methodic doubt approach, this method. And I think this is, at least in the beginning, what Husserl picks up on. It's simply a way to explain how Descartes went wrong, right? So if you start where Descartes started, with this kind of methodical doubt, Husserl starts talking about the epoché, the kind of phenomenological reduction, which brackets questions about metaphysics, and thinks of that as a kind of methodical doubt. In the case of Descartes, he does this first step, but then almost immediately he finds the only way out is to start thinking about the ego as a thing, as a res cogitans, as a substance. And once he asks, what is this thing that thinks, he's off into a metaphysics. And he has to then prove the existence of God and all kinds of things in order to justify and to hold fast to science. Husserl, I think, said, yeah, you don't have to take that second step. You can just stay with the first. You can stay within the phenomenologically reduced sphere and simply describe what your experience is like. And you don't lose anything because you have the whole world there as you experience it. And you can look at that and you can talk about the world and your experience without having to go to the metaphysical. So I think in some way Husserl used Descartes as a way to say what the difference is between what he was doing and what Descartes was doing. That contrast, I think, was important first. But as I say, Descartes is a very rich thinker. He was a mathematician, like Husserl himself. And when in the Crisis, when Husserl, starts writing about the history of geometry and things like that, Descartes comes back in to play a role.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I was just to move on to. So we have let's say we have the meta theory in Husserl, and actually Heidegger is, of course, explicitly, I think, Being and Time is dedicated to Husserl, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And it's so obviously it's a natural, continuation of Husserl's work in some ways. Is there any way in which Heidegger is different from Husserl or adds something that was not there in Husserl in any way whatsoever?
Well, definitely, there are differences, and Husserl started to see that right away. So there's this famous episode where Husserl and Heidegger, tells basically Heidegger to write up an encyclopedia entry, Encyclopedia Britannica, on phenomenology. And Heidegger wrote it, and Husserl didn't want that. So he saw that there was something going on in Heidegger that wasn't quite the same thing that he was doing under the heading of phenomenology. But of course, Heidegger says he's also doing phenomenology. And going back to the original sense of the term, that he's paying attention to the way phenomena, the way the world reveals itself in some fashion. But his big concern is not about human experience so much, at least in terms of his large strategy. He's really interested in the ontological question about the meaning of being. He thinks the way to get to that is through an analysis of human existence, Dasein, and that analysis is important for him in his early work. He moves away from that further. So I always find it more difficult to think of Heidegger as a phenomenologist in his later work. But in his early work, in a certain way, he's looking still at a kind of a transcendental analysis of what exactly are the structures. Husserl was concerned about the structures of consciousness, conscious experience. Heidegger is concerned more about the structures of human existence. And this analysis of Dasein is an attempt to get at that in order to figure out how it's possible for the human being to even ask the question about being and so forth. So, my own view is that phenomenology is a very broad umbrella, and that with every phenomenologist, you find something different. That phenomenology, I think it's very hard to define in a very precise way, simply because every time you look at a phenomenologist, they seem to be doing something different from the other phenomenologists. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting to note that actually Husserl did have some impact on analytic philosophy in the English-speaking world in the 20th century, whereas I think Heidegger was usually dismissed. So if you look at, I know Russell dismisses Heidegger, doesn't care so much about him. Husserl still has had an impact, and probably maybe it was because he was more like philosophy of mind type of philosopher, whereas Heidegger gets this very abstract ontology. So I don't know, I'm just speculating on why Heidegger did not have until very recently, was not really paid attention to by analytical philosophers of mind.
It is interesting. Husserl, early on, Husserl had this correspondence with Frege, and wrote a book about the logical investigations where he sort of rejects psychologistic readings of the mind, and that sort of is on the same page as Frege. I think they start to diverge at a certain point. And there are a number of analytic philosophers who sort of read Husserl in a certain way that they can understand and so forth on that kind of basis. Heidegger is more of a difficult case, I think, for them. Part of it has to do with his language, the kind of terminology he uses, and what he's ultimately trying to do. I think there is. I don't know too much about his debate with Carnap, but there was some kind of debate he had with Carnap that sort of there's a kind of intersection there with analytic philosophy. I think Gilbert Ryle had read Heidegger as well and wrote a review of Being and Time. Ryle was also interested in Husserl. There was some story about Ryle wanting to teach a course on phenomenology at Oxford, and perhaps not getting enough students, so he couldn't teach it or something. And then there was this very famous meeting just outside of Paris at Royaumont. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where Merleau-Ponty and the Father von Breda from the Husserl archives and a number of phenomenologists invited a number of analytic philosophers from Oxford, including Ryle. Quine was there, A.J. Ayer, J.L. Austin. It's a whole set of analytic philosophers came over. They had a real interesting meeting where they did try to communicate with each other. Some people have said it didn't really work. But then I think there were a number of things, especially from Austin and A.J. Ayer, who seemed to respect more, and even Ryle himself sometimes called what he did phenomenology. And he was quite familiar. Dan Dennett, in fact, who studied with Ryle, always thought of Ryle as a kind of phenomenologist, of a different sort, I guess. But, so it's interesting that there are these intersections every now and then with analytic philosophy. And in my own experience, what I found was I could, in fact, communicate with analytic philosophers within the philosophy of mind tradition, as long as we were reading the same empirical science, right? The psychological experiments and neuroscience and so forth. If we're reading that same stuff, we can actually talk to one another in a meaningful way. And I think that whole divide is not as serious as it used to be in 20th century philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. So I that's a very good point, because I think the empirical basis, that's very important in Merleau-Ponty, right? And you don't have such things in Heidegger. But then once you are also the editor of the journal Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences, and that's a journal that's focused on the the interaction between phenomenology and empirical psychology, cognitive science, and so on. So now once we kind of once we realize, okay, here is someone like Merleau-Ponty who actually combines it really, really, really nicely, then we get back to Heidegger and we see it through those lenses, and we say, oh yeah, here this distinction was there, and it was actually, I think we see it differently after we filter it through what we are doing right now. So for me, for example, I was always scared of Heidegger. I don't know, what is metaphysics? I was reading a few pages and say, man, okay, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm not going to read. But now I'm excited when I read something and I see something that I'm more or less, familiar with. For example, what you mentioned, the readiness to hand versus being present at hand. And so I think, I think you are someone, for me at least, who actually tamed this, Heideggerian existentialism and phenomenology. it looked a bit scary to me. And then when I read your work, it was like, yeah, look, it really makes sense. And, you know, it's not obscure and fancy and, you know, something like that.
I have this habit of trying to, yeah, retrieve certain aspects of different philosophers, even someone like Hegel, I think can be important for the particular issue that I might have to be working on. You know, so.
Yeah, so just to move on to Heidegger, or keep a bit more on Heidegger. So of course we have this famous examples that he gives. I was just reading today as I'm preparing for next week, you know, the hammer, and that's, you know, everyone remembers that.
Yeah.
And the hammer as an instrument, as a tool, right? And he has this idea that we have a special relationship to a tool as a tool, qua tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could tell us briefly, like, what are the ways in which I could take a hammer but not consider it as a tool, and therefore it would not really be an authentic kind of experience fit for that hammer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, his analysis of that is a famous one. So if you think of a carpenter who is used to dealing with a hammer every day, picking it up, and the carpenter doesn't have to think about it. He sees the hammer and he just grabs it and starts hammering. And what he's thinking of is what he's going to do after work, going to the pub or going to the beach next weekend or something like that. Or he might be talking to one of his coworkers, but he's not thinking about the hammer. The hammer is almost transparent to him. It's part of his body. Merleau-Ponty would say it's almost an extension of his body schema. And in that respect, you know, his attitude towards the hammer is just purely pragmatic. This is the ready to hand aspect that he talks about. But then the famous point is that if the hammer happens to break while he's using it, then suddenly there's a transformation. It's no longer transparent. It's no longer part of his body schema. It's something that he has to fix. He has to do something with this. And he's therefore taking a very different attitude, an attitude that has to do with treating the thing as an object rather than as a tool that can be used, but rather as an object that itself needs to be fixed or something like that. And Heidegger's big point here, I think, is that for most of the history of philosophy, philosophers have thought about the world in that second way, as if the world is just this objective thing out in front of us and we are simply observers of the world, thinking about it theoretically, speculatively, and so forth. Whereas what we miss when we do that is this more pragmatic attitude, this idea that these objects around us, the world, the environment around us, is first of all a very pragmatic setting for our projects. That there's really what's important here is a kind of relationship between me and the world, between the subject and the world. And that relationship is, at least in part, a pragmatic one. And we miss that entirely if we're simply taking the world as an observed object. And so he thinks that the whole history of philosophy has really missed something here that's important for our considerations about the larger questions about existence and being.
Yeah, so this brings me to Merleau-Ponty, because now we have, in Merleau-Ponty, we have the body as the center of many things. And that's clearly a change of focus. I think Merleau-Ponty himself traces his own view as being influenced by Husserl. I was watching a video by Dreyfus from some time ago where he says, no, actually, there's more Heidegger in Merleau-Ponty. Regardless of this, it's clear that in Merleau-Ponty you have now you know, the body as a condition on many things, including your perception of the world, but also at some point he talks about space. So even objective space, right? Even space itself is not something independent of the way we are built and the way we are situated in the world. So what I want to ask you about Merleau-Ponty is, obviously he elaborates a lot. I mean, you know, his most famous book, Phenomenology of Perception, is like he elaborates a lot of ideas, and he has also a lot of empirical data. So he's also naturalistic in many ways. What can we say about, let's say, comparing Merleau-Ponty, let's say about visual perception with anything that is a non-phenomenological approach to visual perception, which is relevant to embodied cognition? In what way is embodied cognition something that completely changes the way we understand perception? Let's say visual perception for now.
Yeah, well, that's a really good and difficult question to answer. I think Merleau-Ponty was influenced not only by Heidegger and Husserl, and here Dreyfus emphasizes Heidegger, but that's because Dreyfus doesn't like Husserl that much. So, but he likes Heidegger and he likes Merleau-Ponty. Yeah, Merleau-Ponty was influenced not just by Heidegger and Husserl and the phenomenological tradition, but also by his readings in psychology and especially Gestalt psychology. So he learns quite a bit from the Gestalt psychology. And in his early writings, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes you know, what he calls form or structure, or the Gestalt that is involved in perception. And I think that although he was very familiar with the science of his time and all of that, quite a lot of what Merleau-Ponty is saying, I think, is quite consistent with some of the science today. Some of the ecological psychology, Gibson himself being influenced by Merleau-Ponty. So there's a lot there when we think about perception in terms of affordances. Merleau-Ponty is already thinking that way. But even when you look at the neuroscience, there's a lot in the neuroscience that tells us that perception is set up this way, because perception is not something that is divorced from the motoric aspects of what the brain is doing, for example. So motor processes and perceptual processes can go hand in hand, or are in fact very much integrated. And I think Merleau-Ponty was saying something like that too, that embodied perception involves the motor system, ties into the notion of the I can, of the Zuhanden, of the affordance. We perceive the world in these pragmatic terms, and that's because we are embodied. Now, if you take a look at vision science, there's a lot of vision science that simply abstracts away from context, abstracts away from anything like pragmatic intention, and just says, okay, what do we see? You know, and they set up experiments that really abstract away from the everyday ecological context of our embodied existence. So you do get a lot of vision science on one side, making certain claims, but that's only because I think they have been very influenced by experiments that have been really set up in an abstract fashion. They don't kind of capture types of things that Merleau-Ponty and Gibson and so forth embodied cognition are saying.
Yeah, so we have this famous patient Schneider in Merleau-Ponty, and we have this idea of abstract motion, and we have the idea of intrinsic locatedness of the body and the intrinsic locatedness of parts of the body. And this patient suffers from a condition, I think he calls it psychic blindness or psychological blindness. If you could explain to us what exactly is important about this, because he talks a lot about this, and what are Merleau-Ponty's conclusions regarding philosophical conclusions about this patient, who cannot, maybe you can explain what the patient cannot do, right?
Yeah, Schneider is a very complicated case, simply because he was a patient of Galvin Goldstein, who Merleau-Ponty read, but Merleau-Ponty never met Schneider, never was able to examine Schneider, so he was going on what Goldstein especially was saying. Goldstein had that nice distinction between abstract and concrete behavior, where abstract behavior would be something like, following a command that you were given to point to your nose. Right? You can do that very easily. Schneider couldn't. But the concrete was, if a fly lands on your nose, you can brush it away. And he could do that. So Goldstein says, okay, here in this case, Schneider is capable of concrete action, but not capable of abstract action. So this is part of what Merleau-Ponty thinks is important, because he wants to talk about a kind of motor intentionality that one in, again, everyday type of actions engages with, that is perhaps different in Schneider, but still somehow or other intact. Whereas a more intellectually informed type of activity is something that is definitely a problem for Schneider. So that's part of what he's trying to work out, some kind of sense of motor intentionality, and he sees Schneider as offering a particular kind of pathological example that might help us get to that distinction that Goldstein himself was interested in. Goldstein also was influenced by Gestalt psychology, and he has this nice claim that you can't take the abstract away from the concrete. They are kind of, again, intersected. But again, if you can find a particular dissociation in a pathology, you can say, well, these are distinct things, even if they are in everyday action, very closely integrated. I think because Schneider is such a complex case in the sense that we don't know a lot about Schneider. What was his brain? What was going? He had shrapnel from the First World War, so he had brain damage from that, but it wasn't quite clear what that damage was. And there's some biographical information that Schneider functioned pretty well in terms of his everyday life, nonetheless, and actually became the mayor of a village in Germany as part of his career. So his everyday action was apparently good enough to survive, and it's another kind of important lesson from that is it's often the case that in the lab, when you're doing experiments, you're discovering something that is not always ecologically the case. So he might live his everyday life in a normal way, but certain things in the laboratory sort of seem to be very different for him.
Yeah, actually, just to speculate about this, I mean, maybe even on evolutionary scale, this might have some relevance to an evolutionary analysis of the mind, because probably the kind of involvement with the world that phenomenologists like to talk about it really makes sense evolutionarily speaking. It clearly has value for fitness, increase of fitness and things like that. Whereas, I don't know, this kind of very artificial kind of perception, for example, this thematization or looking at something as being presented rather than being interacted with seems like almost like an anomaly of some sort of evolution. Because why would we even need, as you said, someone like Schneider could just deal with the world in perfectly well without even knowing that he has this problem, right? And connected to this, I want to ask you, maybe that will be maybe the last question, but so what about the self? Of course, in Merleau-Ponty, the body plays a very important role, and among other things, there is, of course, we have many notions of the self or many layers of the self, and of course, the body for someone like Merleau-Ponty is very tightly connected with a sense of self, which in turn is connected with body ownership and so on. So we have this on the one hand, right? There's a very embodied understanding of the self. And on the other hand, again, we have almost like an anomaly, a very kind of artificial and high level self-reflective notion of self, where I'm lying in bed and I'm just thinking of myself in this kind of, as a Cartesian agent almost, saying like, I ask questions like, who am I? What am I doing here? And this has nothing to do with the body apparently, right? So is there anything that phenomenologists say about this kind of highly self-reflective and highly, I would say, almost like alienating one from one's own body type experience?
Yeah. Well, of course, I think in some sense, if you go back to Husserl, you find quite a bit about that second kind of, I wouldn't say disembodied, but definitely doesn't seem to be closely tied to embodiment, a kind of cognitive, reflective attitude that one can take. And you can see that in Husserl, a lot of that seems to be going on. And I think partly this is what Dreyfus doesn't like about Husserl. And there are some people who think, Husserl is this kind of internalist, just it's not about the body or the world, it's more about the experience. But of course, his notion of intentionality means that we are always sort of directed to the world. So there's debates about how to interpret Husserl. My own sense is that the self is multidimensional, complex. It's embodied. We then talk about certain first order experiences that are closely tied to embodiment. So, and you mentioned sense of ownership, sense of agency. We have these kind of experiential aspects that Gibson talked about, a kind of ecological perception where, whenever we experience the world, we also have a sense of where we are in the world. We also have an experience of ourselves. So I can say almost, just immediately, whether I'm sitting or standing, whether I'm moving or staying still, and so forth, given that I'm getting all of this information about myself and the world at the same time. So some phenomenologists have called that the minimal self. But they also say that kind of, they call it also pre-reflective experience, that pre-reflective experience is absolutely essential for reflective experience. So I can take kind of reflective, sometimes a kind of narrative perspective on myself, and I can talk about myself. So language allows me to do that. Also, there are intersubjective aspects. A lot of people would say that the self is also social in a kind of essential way. Even Heidegger talks about Mitsein, being with, as part of the very structure of Dasein. Husserl talks about intersubjectivity, Merleau-Ponty as well. That seems to be an essential aspect of what the self is. And one's cultural upbringing, the normative aspects of one's existence that have come through social and cultural factors. These are also built into who we are, and how we think about ourselves is often shaped precisely by those types of normative and cultural factors. So I think we get a very complex picture of the self, or what the self is, and it's one might think that if we go back to Descartes or the philosophical tradition, that most of that tradition really has focused on the more cognitive, reflective aspects of self-consciousness. And the phenomenologists have, I think, focused or given us some reason to think that equally important are those pre-reflective aspects of self. And you can't get rid of any of that. So you have to try to see it as more of a complex, maybe gestalt is a good word for it. I use the word pattern sometimes, a pattern of different factors. So I think phenomenologists have a lot to say about all of those things. And not, the one thing I think the phenomenologists are good about is that they don't want to be reductionistic. They don't want to say the self is just this one thing. I think what the phenomenologists have said, we have many different facets to ourselves, and all of them are important to consider.
Yeah, actually, I think my error when I was formulating this idea was that I assumed that, by lying down in bed and just feeling that I'm disconnected from the world, I was only thinking about the world as a kind of lifeless entity. But actually, a lot of the world is other people, right? And that's intersubjectivity. And there's a lot of emphasis on that. I don't know, in existentialism, especially in Sartre, you have famous ideas about this intersubjectivity, the gaze, and this kind of the part of the self that kind of watches over me by me knowing that someone is watching me from the outside. So it might well be that even when I think that I'm disconnected, I'm just lying down in bed and thinking of myself as a kind of Cartesian subject. It's not at all sure that I kind of got rid of all the cultural and social constraints that are implicit in my own existence or something like that.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we could stop here. I don't want to keep you a lot. So I want to thank you a lot for telling us a few words about phenomenology and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. I'm sure that students will ask me a lot of questions because I'm going to ask them to watch this video, and then we will have a discussion in class.
That's great. Thank you very much too. I did want to ask you a couple of questions, though.
Yeah. I'm going to change my background so that we know where this second segment starts, which I'm going to change it to my real world.
Okay.
Which looks like that. Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. I'm happy to answer your questions if I'm competent in answering them.
Okay. Yeah, because I was interested to talk with you about your analysis of bodybuilding, right? Because we're I'm also teaching phenomenology, and we started by talking about Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, all the classic phenomenologists, and then the second part of the course is applied phenomenology. We're looking at various issues having to do with race and gender, so critical phenomenology it's sometimes referred to as, but also we're looking at how phenomenology can help us understand performance. So there we're looking at sports, but also the performing arts, dance, music, and such. Then we'll go on to talk about a little bit about psychiatry and so forth. But right now we're looking at performance, and I know that you've written about various sports, and specifically, I remember you writing about bodybuilding and indicating that it's something less of sport than other sports. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, a little story behind this, like, is one of those claims that, I could call them like folk truths, okay, in quotation marks, the kind of claim that you surely heard it somewhere. If you go on forums like Reddit and internet, since we live in an internet-based world, you will surely find someone just saying like, man, this is not even sport, this is a beauty contest. And you will find like tens of people over time, the last 10, 15 years, just saying that, and everyone agreeing, saying that, yeah, obviously. And so it's one of those claims that seem to me is true, but no one actually wrote it down. No one wrote down an argument for why that is the case. We have many cases like that in all academic fields, philosophy, but also in game theory, you have folk theorems. No one knows who discovered the theorem. So I think this is a folk theorem-like thing. Okay. So I wrote this article, and it's not a super long article, and it's very, let's say, the style is more like classical analytic philosophy. I'm considering objections and trying to analyze. But the main idea is basically based on this distinction between the objective body and the lived body from phenomenology, which you find in various forms in plenty of authors. And the one question that you can ask is, you can ask this question, what makes a sport, right? And interesting enough, there's a journal called Journal of Philosophy of Sport. And in the 70s, they had, for like maybe 5 years, there was a debate about, they were trying to define what is a sport. And they were unsuccessful, right? We shouldn't be surprised because, we are skeptical nowadays about definitions anyway. But I was thinking like, okay, I don't want to try to define what a sport is, but I'm interested, what could be something that seems like a necessary condition for something to be a sport. Now, one thing that I noticed is most of the sports are physical, the sports that are officially listed right now. So only, I think, chess and Go are mental sports. So I'm kind of eliminating them already because it's such a minority and no one is really sure why they were included there. So now, if we say, okay, sport has to do something with the physical performance. Now, the next step we have to ask is, what distinguishes sport performance from other types of performance, right? And again, without getting into trying to find an exhaustive list, you'll see that at least there is something that you need for. So at least sport is about developing and increasing a certain skill. So you do something better than most people, right? And it's physical. So if you take an example like running, all of us who are healthy, we are capable of running. That's not a problem. But not all of us are sports people. Sports people are the ones who dedicate some important part of their lives and time to actually developing this skill. And, depending on the level of competition, they are kind of, the highest levels are, we find exemplars that could be shown, let's say, to some aliens who come and say, look, here are the best people who can run in our species, right? So obviously it has to do with skill. Now the next question is, what does that mean that something is skillful activity, right? And one idea that I have is that in that paper is that, well, it is not something passive. It is something that is active, dynamic, right? And that brings me to the distinction now of, now this is about your own body. Your body is moving, whatever sports you do, there is some kind of motion, some kind of activity. Now, what makes it, skillful? Well, at some point it needs to do, it has to do with the lived body, the fact that, and that will bring us back to the notion of skill and what you need for skill, and whether skill is disturbed by thinking or not, and questions like that. But for now, let's say that, well, it is motion dynamics, and it is about using your body rather than thinking about your body, watching your body, or have your body analyzed or watched by other people. Of course, they do watch you if you are a sports person. Of course, there are spectators. They are looking at the competition, and they applaud and they admire. But that's not the essence of what you are doing, right? And it's an empirical question. What would happen if you started thinking of, going on the field, playing soccer, and saying like, wow, I'm so interested in what people see right now. How do I look like? Like as if you are looking in a mirror and you're checking how you look like. Right?
Yeah.
It's an empirical question whether that would make your performance better or worse. But in any case, the performance itself doesn't seem to be connected to that kind of attitude that you might have, right? Now, if that's true, if you take bodybuilding, at least in the competition stage, because bodybuilding is weird because of the very clear distinction between the preparation stage and the competition stage. And I think this is the key to why I think, bodybuilding is not really a sport. The competition stage is basically a competition of presenting your body. Is a kind of self-reification or self-objectification that you perform. It is a performance. I'm not saying it's not a performance, but it is the kind of performance in which you present your body to a jury who will judge, how well you conform to certain, criteria about how someone should look like, in terms of muscle, in terms of your aspect, muscular aspect, right? And so I think what I argue for is that this is the key that distinguishes it from other sports. If you take any other sports, none of them is about using your body as presented to someone and self-thematizing or self-presenting or self-objectifying your body. For that reason, people connected to, well, people on the internet, okay, people who just comment, they say, well, it's like, beauty contests. And I think that's right, because in the beauty contest, by definition in the beauty contest, you show something. Of course, it's more than just your body, and it's unfortunately we have this still the sexist society. Beauty contests are called what women do, and bodybuilding is, it is officially a beauty contest because you have this Mr. Universe, Mr. Olympia, even the names. But at the same time, the beauty contest for women is not considered a sport, but for men it is, right? Which I think is weird. But in the end, in essence, they are not so different as what's going on. On the contrary, there might be more sport in the women's beauty contest than in the bodybuilding competitions. So what happens? You will show your body, and someone will judge. Someone from the outside will judge your body, right? Now think about take running. Okay, what is judged in running? Well, it is the result, whether you won and which place you are. Are you the first one, the second, the third? What's your time? And that correlate. That basically is synonymous with performance. The better you are at running, the shorter the time that you will run, that distance. So there's no fancy thing going on there. No one is judging the way you ran. No one is judging how beautifully you ran, how your legs were moving, how your arms were moving. Although we could have such a sport, we could set up something like a running beauty contest, right? Where you would say we are watching, and it would be similar to dance, right? Where you do judge, and we can talk about dance, this sports, dance as a sports discipline, because I think what makes that still sport is that it's not purely about the way it looks. It's also, the skill, is the motion, and so on. So to summarize, I think, bodybuilding is, there is not much action going on. So the only action that's going on in the competition stage is, flexing. But flexing the muscle is not, I argue in the paper, I have a longer argument, but flexing is not complex enough to qualify as skill, right? It's such a short and automatic almost, well, it's not automatic, but so hardwired, okay? It's so hardwired because we flex all the time when we do something. Now we just learn to flex at will and so on. And therefore it could not count as a skill. Again, I argue that we could set up a sport of that kind if we wanted to, and that would be like precision flexing or something. There would be special ways to measure how people flex, how nicely they flex. But so far, what we see in the way bodybuilding is conceptualized today is basically really about the beauty of the body, male and female, right? And which is defined via the muscular apparatus, muscular system, right? So it's really devised and has a meaning only for the gaze, as it were, to use this notion of the gaze, right? And it is something that, compared to the Sartrean gaze, is basically something that people do. They accept, they assume it as, this is my job. I show myself to the world. So I think that's the summary. That's the summary of my point about bodybuilding.
Okay. I wanted to ask, have you been recording this?
Yeah.
Oh, good, because I forgot to turn my recorder on.
Yeah, I'll send you the.
You can send it to me, great.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, then I guess the one question I had was about the relationship between, the bodybuilding itself, as opposed to the display of the body in the contest. The bodybuilding itself has to do with exercise, lifting weights, and having a certain type of knowledge about what you're doing and how you're shaping your body. So then I wonder if there isn't a kind of tight connection between that type of activity that allows you to shape your body and then the contest where people are judging. So are they judging simply about how the body looks, or are they judging somehow or other the process that got the body to look that way? So if they're looking at a certain muscle, for example, and the way it's shaped, are they not appreciating the kind of work and technique that went into shaping that muscle, and maybe judging in some sense, not just the way it looks, but judging that process?
Well, I don't think they do. So, of course, it must be, because we know these correlations. We know that, you can look at the body and say, oh, there must have been a lot of work put into developing that muscle, which otherwise it's very difficult to develop. So I think the shoulder is such a muscle. We use it so much that it's very difficult to have it grow, to trigger its growth. But of course, there is such a thing. But I don't think it's essential in the judgment itself. Because take another thing. Of course, genetics is also important. And if you read bodybuilding magazines like Flex, the most famous bodybuilding magazine, they would, the experts in bodybuilding who are, judging based on pictures, and they are comparing bodies. Many times they bring genetics into the picture and say, wow, this is really good genetics. So some people just have huge lats, the back is just, and most people just will not be able to develop that. You need that. And they even praise genetics, whereas genetics really has nothing to do with skill. So of course it's true that these aspects will get into your judgment, but in the end, I think officially you are even not supposed to. I think what's considered objective judgment is for you to detach yourself from everything that's not just what you see on the spot. Of course, except for doping, because that's illegal, right? And it's a big question whether doping should be illegal or not in bodybuilding, because genetics also plays a role. It's not like if your bone structure is not built for that, you can take all the doping in the world and you won't make it there, right?
Yeah.
But regardless of that, I think in the end, it is actually expected of the referees to just simply neglect any information that they might have about uh, the sports person, and just judge the visual,
Yeah.
the way it appears,
Yeah.
right?
So let me just press a little bit further, and that is that description seems to fit very well. I mean, what you're saying fits very well the perspective of the judge who's looking at the body. But I'm wondering about the perspective of the bodybuilder, him or herself, whether that competition is something like maybe the end result, but it's only the end result of a long process where there is some skill involved, and they have been working hard and skillfully at building their body. So bodybuilding is this whole thing, right? And to sort of say, okay, here's the end, the contest, so to speak, and look, it's basically something like a beauty contest, is sort of to cut that off from all the rest of it, it would seem to me.
Yeah.
At least from the perspective of the bodybuilder, him or herself,
Yeah.
it's there's a lot more going on than just looking good.
Yeah, that's right. So I agree. It's in that sense, it's like any other sport. There's a lot of preparation. It's not just, and preparation has to be very intelligent. It needs to involve knowledge, also theoretical knowledge, and knowledge about nutrition, knowledge about and exercise work, and that's going to be skillful. I do compare it in the paper with the. So really, the difference in the end is the competition, but of course you are right to say why don't we take bodybuilding, which I agree is this whole process, right? Because it's building. Building is a process.
Yes.
There would not be bodybuilding if there were angels such that if you are friends with them and they do that, you become Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
It would not make sense to have competitions about it because it would be about whether the angels like you or not. So I think that's right. So of course I'm a bit provocative in the paper. I'm trying to trigger. I hope the bodybuilders won't beat me up on the street, but I try to trigger. Be provocative about it, saying like it's not sport. But more correctly, I could say, well, it's a very different kind of sport. It's special in some way. It has something that other sports don't have. The closest you get to it is powerlifting, but and powerlifting is really no different from running or football or because it really measures your strength. And strength is not simple flexing. It is basically, it's a measure of your peripheral nervous system reactivity, muscle recruitment, things like that. Because what does strength mean? Well, it means how quickly your muscle fibers are recruited for pushing that weight. And there's training and so on. And the competition is basically you can measure that, and it's more like it's not an aesthetic thing. So maybe the interesting and important thing that makes bodybuilding different is to get deeper into this gaze kind of thing is the aesthetics and the fact that another way to put it is like, why do we call it sport? And I didn't want to get into, because I don't want to do sociology of sport, but it is a bit weird that we call that a sport, and there are other activities that are similar. We don't call them a sport, and clearly there is something that makes bodybuilding special and different from all the others in terms of skill. I still believe that this is true, but of course I agree with you that of course we shouldn't be dismissive of it and saying like, well, it's just of course sure. It's a whole process, and building the body is like, and as I understand it is also, it's like martial arts, and martial arts are not about how you fight with someone, right?
Yeah.
The whole lifestyle and it's development, exactly.
So just one more point, and this relates to a kind of ongoing debate. I don't know if you're familiar with Jason Stanley's work on know-how and yeah, the difference between knowing how and knowing that. And he's an intellectualist. You know, he would say know-how is simply reducible to propositional knowledge. It's about knowing that very specific types of facts will amount to know-how. And he would disagree, for example, with Dreyfus. And skill isn't really, yeah, he's got a specific thing about skill too, that he really thinks of that as just simply ability. But that ability and a lot of the bodily types of things that go into performance are really automatic in some fashion. But the real guidance, the real skill, somehow or other comes from the top. It's a sort of propositional type of knowledge that we have. So he's got a nice, interesting little discussion about bodybuilding. I don't know if you're familiar with this, about lifting weights. And he cites another philosopher who has spoken about this, Carl Jeanette. And he has this one example, which I'll read to you. He says in a paper, Carl Jeanette put it this way. Jeanette says, "It would not be right to report the fact that I am able to lift 100 pounds off the floor, but my 8-year-old son is not able to do that." It's not the right way to put it by saying that I know how to do this, but he does not know how. Insofar as there is any knowing how involved, he knows how just as well as I do. He just doesn't have the strength to do it. So Stanley likes this. He says, yeah, knowing how just is kind of knowing the facts about lifting and so forth. And the son doesn't have the strength that the father does. He's not able to do it. So it's about ability rather than know-how. But the son certainly knows how to do it. And I wonder if that's true. I mean, because you might argue that there is a certain skill involved in lifting weights. And the 8-year-old son might not have that skill.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree. There is definitely some skill. So of course, and I think maybe it's just about the surface linguistic structure that it doesn't seem correct to say that the son doesn't know how. Say, oh, this doesn't sound well. No, it doesn't sound good. I'm not even sure if in other languages this would sound good or not. So I'm a bit skeptical that this is a knockdown argument. And second, as you say, yeah, it's not at all obvious that there is no skill. Of course, I think there are degrees of how much skill you need, for various activities. Take the automatic ones, breathing, of course. There's no skill, it's completely automatic. Flexing, well, when you use something like a tool, to use a Heidegger's hammer, it would be even worse than, because you could focus on the hammer and watch it, but even worse, you could actually it might happen, you could focus on the way it feels, your muscle feel, the muscle tension, and the weight of the hammer. I have a very heavy hammer in my house, which I used in my lecture last week to show it, and it does feel, it's so heavy that actually it's kind of pleasant feeling that you have this strength of holding it and so on. But what I want to say is that yes, I'm not totally, it doesn't seem totally obvious to me that that the son knows how to, and the only reason I think, because I'm also I think it's a good example, right? And I think the only reason we are kind of pushed towards in that direction is because it is a simple kind of thing. It seems like a simple thing. It's just like, well, what does it mean? Well, it just means lifting something, right?
Yeah.
I lift this, but actually
Yeah.
it's not the same. The surface is the same. Lifting this and lifting that, heavy weight might actually involve very, very different things, and even intellectually. So I'm not totally convinced about this example as a knockdown argument for reducing know-how to knowing that.
Good. I think we agree then on that, because I would think that lifting 100 pounds is going to be different from lifting 200 pounds. Even an experienced weightlifter might have to not just know the fact that this is 200 versus 100, but they would have to know something with respect to what their body can do and how they would approach doing this, and that there's some kind of skill involved in there that's more embodied.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be absurd if I watched a really good, I don't know, piano player? I don't play the piano at all. And I said, well, and he played a very, very difficult piece. And I said, well, yeah, I know how to play it. It's just I don't have the skill to do it. Kind of absurd, right? It's like, no, you have no idea. I mean, because it doesn't qualify. It's like, I know that he's moving the fingers in a certain way, and maybe I could even learn by watching it on a tape, on a video recording, and say, yeah, I know he's doing this and this and that and that. It might be an arpeggio or something. He does that. Give me the piano and I can't do it, right? And I think it would be absurd to say like, oh, it's not about know-how because I know how to do it. It's just like I lack the skill, right?
No, I think we're in agreement on all of that. That's good. Well, so we're gonna talk a little bit about Jason Stanley's argument in our class.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think an even better example to think about, and maybe connected in a nice way to this. What about the arts? Because dance, for example, is a complex. It is skill, physical skill, but it also is supposed to express something, and it is an interaction between a viewer and the performer, and there's a lot of things involved there. So for example, I don't think there's any way we could say that, well, the know-how is basically a kind of more complicated knowing that, because there are so many factors that intervene, including the idea of what does it mean to express something with your body, right? And I'm not an expert in dance at all, but I don't know. Even I am moved sometimes by, I don't know if you know the choreographer called Maurice Béjart.
Don't.
Yeah, so it's really, I will send you a link to. He has this really weird and interesting contemporary dance choreographies, and and that's something that I can watch because I don't watch ballet and stuff. I get bored, but and this one's like, wow, this is interesting, and and especially coupled with the way he calls the titles of the dances and so on, you kind of see the. So for that example, it's very hard to see Jason Stanley's type of argument, even getting off the ground, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's very good. Yeah. Okay, Istvan, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Good luck with your class, and
thank you.
So you'll be able to send me a recording, or put it on someplace where I can download it.
Sure. So I'll put it on. The thing is, it's gonna be long, but I think the part with me that's useful for you, I will cut it, and that will be shorter, and I'll send it to you. Great. Or upload it somewhere where you can download it from.
Okay.
We are going to do it tonight or tomorrow. Tomorrow, the latest we'll have it.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah, you too. I hope to see you in physical space as well soon.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Okay. Thanks again.
We'll keep in touch.
Okay. Have a nice day. See you.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.